The year was 1843. Charles Dickens, at age 31, had managed to establish himself as a popular contemporary author, having released 5 books by this point, the most popular of which had sold more than 100,000 copies each. However, the current novel he was working on, The Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit, was gravely underperforming at only 20,000 installments sold per month. And what I mean when I say installments is that a book would be released in divided parts as they were being written, with one part released per month. This was done to draw in the consumer who wouldn't or couldn't necessarily drop a ton of money on a big expensive book all at once, but could spare a couple shillings a month on a story that they might be interested in. This serial method had only started to become popular around 6 or 7 years prior to this, and was not the universal format of release to which all books must adhere. There were books being released as one complete product, but all of the novels being released by Dickens at this point were serialized. So when Martin Chuzzlewit performed badly from the get-go, his publishers wanted to cut his monthly pay per installment from £200 down to £150. This would have been devastating for Charles Dickens. He was already struggling to provide for his family before the salary cut, and his wife was pregnant with their 5th child. Because of their financial issues, the Dickens family had started to consider leaving England for Italy, where the cost of living was much lower. So Mr. Dickens was proceeding through the early months of 1843, very much with desperation staring him in the face. It was during this time that Dickens' friend, Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith, sent him a copy of the Children's Employment Commission report. This report was a written account of 3 years' worth of investigation into the treatment of working women and children, some just as young as 5 years old. The interviews in the report were compiled by 4 members of the Royal Children's Employment Commission, one of whom was Dr. Southwood Smith, and divided into 2 parts. Part 1 focused on the treatment of women and children working in the mines, and it was so horrifying that Parliament immediately passed the Mines and Collieries Act of 1842, which forbid boys under 10 and all women from working in underground labor. Part 2 documented the conditions of women and children in factories, and the findings were just as gruesome. Charles Dickens had himself worked in a factory as a child. Growing up, his family had been financially unstable and by the age of 10 could no longer afford to send him to school. At the age of 12, his parents forced him to accept a job at a shoe polish factory and sent him away to board with another family during his employment. Shortly after he started working, his father was arrested over a debt of £40 and 10 shillings, which would be around £4,700 or $6,200 today. John Dickens was freed 3 months later after receiving an inheritance due to his mother's passing, and although he and his wife initially wanted their son to continue working, after quarreling with his employer, Charles was allowed to quit and return to school, for a time at least. While employed at the factory, Dickens had worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, attaching covers and labels to pots of black shoe polish in a warehouse he described as a crazy, tumbled-down old house, abutting of course on the river and literally overrun with rats. Its wainscoted rooms and its rotten floors and staircase, and the old gray rats swarming down in the cellars, and the sound of their squeaking and scuffling coming up the stairs at all times, and the dirt and decay of the place rise up visibly before me as if I were there again. He earned 6 shillings a week, which is around £35 or $46 today. This experience was extremely emotionally damaging for Dickens, who carried it throughout his life and only ever shared it with 2 people while he was alive, his wife and his biographer. It's one of the reasons he developed such deep empathy for the plight of impoverished children. Upon receiving his friend's report, Dickens' reaction was immediate. He started making plans to publish a pamphlet. It was going to be titled An Appeal to the People of England on Behalf of the Poor Man's Child. It was going to be released in March of 1843, just 1 month after Part 2 of the report had been released. But the more that Dickens thought about it, the more he tried to figure out the best way to draw in people's attention and make them care about this, the more he seemed to realize that voicing his appeal in the form of a story would be much more effective. Now all he had to do was think of a story. In July of 1843, Dickens took a 3-week vacation to visit his friend Charles Smithson, a solicitor who worked on Chancery Lane in Malton. Dickens was no stranger to the world of law himself. At the age of 15, he was once again unable to afford to attend school and had to drop out and get a job. He found himself a position as an attorney's clerk at Ellis & Blackmore, and then a year later as a court reporter for the Court of Chancery. And it was during that time in his young life that he started to develop a deep-seated distaste for law in Parliament, which would become a common theme throughout his works. After his vacation in Malton, Dickens returned to work. He resumed writing his installments of Martin Chuzzlewit and continued to advocate for the rights of underprivileged people. In May, he attended a fundraising dinner for a charity that provided care for destitute elderly men. But he was further disgusted when all of the other attendees appeared to be rich men who felt the need to flaunt their wealth in front of each other. In September, he visited the Field Lane Ragged School, located in one of the poorest areas of London. Ragged schools were a form of charity-supported education. Their aim was to provide free basic education, vocational training, and religious instruction. After his visit, Dickens would write that yes, the system on which the school operated was deeply flawed, specifically noting that it relied a little too much on religion for his taste, but that there was also potential there and that it was a worthy cause to donate money to. A month later, on the 5th of October, Dickens gave a speech in support of the Manchester Athenaeum, a charity providing educational and recreational resources for working people. While in Manchester, he stayed with his sister Fanny, her husband Henry Burnett, and their 2 children. The elder of the 2 sons, 4-year-old Harry, had a physical disability, and as Dickens observed some of the challenges he faced in navigating everyday life, it struck him how much more difficult it would be for a child to face those same obstacles if he were instead born to one of the many struggling families on the streets of the city. Manchester in the 1840s was one of the cities most heavily impacted by the Industrial Revolution. Their population had more than doubled since the time of Dickens' birth to the time that he gave his speech, due to huge swaths of people moving in to find employment in the expanding cotton industry. Factories being able to churn out thousands more products units per day using a proto-assembly line structure had decimated the family-centered cottage industry, and due to sharp declines in trading in 1839, unemployment was on an exponential rise. And although wages were relatively high and the average income did increase for families that could manage to find employment, even then it came at the expense of the worker. Since the goal of each factory was to produce as many units as possible, employees were devalued and dehumanized into solely the number of units they could complete per hour. Women were paid half or less of what men were paid for the same work, and children could be paid as little as 1/6. Safety was a non-consideration, leading to frequent injury and even death. Many of these victims were children whom, since they were so small, were often asked to climb up into the machines for cleaning or repairs. It was these children who offered many of the testimonies included in the report that Dickens had read in February. Injured employees would slow down the production rate and thus were fired. Employees who needed time off for any reason would mean a temporarily idle machine, which would slow down the production rate and thus were fired. To make matters even worse, the effects of the Corn Laws were in full swing. Corn law is a term that can refer to any type of government regulation having to do with the import and export of grain, but is most often used to specifically refer to the Importation Act 1815. During the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon's continental blockade had made it impossible to trade with the continent. As a result, agricultural landlords and the farmers that rented from them had experienced an increase in profits. Parliament, which was comprised mostly of these landlords, was worried that once the embargo was lifted, grain prices would fall and they would make less money. So in order to combat this, they passed Importation Act 1815, which affixed such high tariffs onto imported grain that there was no point in buying it. The act was later modified to add that grain could be imported duty-free once the domestic price surpassed 80 shillings per 8 bushels. In 1816, riots broke out when prices were pushed even higher due to food shortages. A massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia had disrupted global weather patterns, causing crops to wither. Agricultural laborers had their wages cut in order to maximize what little profit there was. In industrial cities, even though wages were high, as the price of food continued to increase, the less and less disposable income people were able to make. As the situation slowly grew worse, even factory owners started to become concerned, not for their employees' well-being, but rather that were the Corn Laws not stopped, they would have to pay them more money. And so, in 1839, they established the Anti-Corn Law League. The League was made with the intent of uniting the middle class against landlords in Parliament in order to get the Corn Laws repealed. Despite the plethora of abuses being hurled upon the working class, it was still common for more privileged peoples to believe that it was their own fault and that they deserved it, not unlike what many people still believe to this day. In the Victorian era, it was common to believe that working class people were almost an entirely separate category of human than the upper and middle classes. It was believed that they were inherently more lazy and immoral, and that thus offering to help a struggling person would just encourage them to become more lazy. Economist and Reverend Thomas Malthus popularized the idea that if a working family received too much disposable income and became too comfortable, they were more likely to have more children, and that this was to blame for the population boom. The proposed solution to this problem then would be to lower wages to the minimum amount necessary for survival and to dissuade all forms of charity and welfare. Malthus's ideals were hugely influential, and in 1834, a new poor law was passed that eliminated all forms of government financial relief and left only the workhouse. When entering the workhouse, children would be separated from their parents and spouses would be separated from each other to try and prevent them from having more children. Once inside, occupants would have their hair cropped short, receive a shoddily made uniform, and be put to such grueling tasks as breaking stone, crushing bone, or picking oakum. They would receive 2 meals a day. These would be nutritionally devoid, and people often starved to death. These conditions were meant to be inhumane. They were intended to be, because Malthusians believed that the fear of having to go to the workhouse would encourage people to try harder to lift themselves out of poverty and dissuade their supposed laziness. As Dickens returned home, horrified by the poverty he had seen on the streets of Manchester and the corrupt ideals that had made it so, he was struck with an idea. He would write a novella for Christmas, the season of charitable giving. The story would be a political one, directly addressing the privileged classes and asking them to re-examine their beliefs and treat working people with empathy. To construct his tale, Dickens took inspiration from other Christmas stories that had made an impact on him. In coming up with a plot, he may have taken inspiration from the short story How Mr. Chokepear Keeps a Merry Christmas, written by his friend Douglas Jerrold in 1841. The story follows businessman Mr. Chokepear on Christmas Day as he celebrates with his family, only to reveal at the end all of the suffering the Chokepears have inflicted on others due to their classism. And a story he most certainly must have taken inspiration from was his own short story, published in 1836, The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton. In this tale, the cantankerous sexton, Gabriel Grubb, is abducted by goblins on Christmas Eve. They use their magic to show him the Christmas scenes of neighboring poor families, leaving him a changed man in the morning. As for the setting, although the story was set in London, Dickens drew upon his July visit to Malton for details. He based Scrooge's counting house on the same one his friend Charles Smithson worked in on Chancery Lane, and the bells that rang on Christmas morning to wake him from his dream were based on the ones found in St. Leonard and St. Mary's Catholic Church. In creating his main character, Dickens took the words screw, which meant stingy in Victorian slang, and gouge, combining them to form a name, Scrooge. Mr. Scrooge was designed to be the embodiment of the ultimate wealthy Malthusian and directly espouses their views early on in the book. "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "And the union workhouses, are they still in operation?" "They are, still," returned the gentleman. "I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor, then?" said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid from what you had said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I am very glad to hear it. I don't make myself merry at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are very badly off must go there." "Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge's cheerful nephew Fred serves as a rebuttal to Malthusianism, treating Bob Cratchit with sympathy when his son dies, and offering to help in any way that he can. Fred was likely named after Dickens' younger brother Frederick, whom had been his favorite brother as a child, and Dickens would continue to think fondly of him until a falling out in 1845, 3 years after the events discussed in this video took place. To criticize the mass dehumanization and abuse of employees happening all around him, Dickens created Mr. Fezziwig, a good-natured businessman who employed Scrooge in his youth. To contrast Scrooge's own cruelty towards his employee Bob Cratchit, Fezziwig treats his employees with kindness, even throwing them a Christmas party with his family. In this way, Dickens argued that workers deserved to be valued as more than the extent of what they can contribute, and that employers were responsible for their well-being, or lack thereof. The Fezziwigs and their celebration were based on another family in a book that Dickens was very familiar with, The Bracebridges, from the Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, authored by Washington Irving. The book was released when Dickens was 8 and had been hugely influential on him growing up. When he and Irving became friends for a short time, he had sent him a letter expressing how much he, as a child, had loved the chapters devoted to the merry festivities of a traditional Yorkshire Christmas, described in exquisite detail. In incorporating these attributes into his own work through the Fezziwigs, Dickens was also trying to appeal to the public's nostalgia, making them long for the years before industrialization, when small, family-owned businesses could still thrive. Bob Cratchit served as Scrooge's law clerk, a position Dickens was, of course, very well acquainted with, being the first job he'd gotten after having to drop out of school. And Tiny Tim was based on his young, disabled nephew Harry, whom he'd seen in Manchester. At the end of the novel, Scrooge develops a closeness with Tim that is described as being akin to a second father. Dickens uses this to advocate for the softening of class boundaries, a theme also present in the way Fred treats Bob Cratchit and the way the Fezziwigs mingle with their employees. Tiny Tim's name went through a number of iterations before Dickens settled on the final version, the earliest being Little Fred. He may have gotten the name from Frederick, the same brother he later used to name Scrooge's nephew, or he may have gotten it from another younger brother named Alfred, but personally I think it's more likely he was initially named for another Dickens sibling, also named Alfred, who had passed away at 5 months of age when Dickens was 2 years old. Tragically, his nephew Harry would also pass away in 1849 at the age of 9. The Ghost of Christmas Present is the character most openly critical of Scrooge, and through him, Dickens is able to directly confront Malthusianism. When Scrooge worries for Tiny Tim's fate, the spirit thrusts his old words back in his face. If he be like to die, he'd better do it, and decrease the surplus population. He goes on again to attack the class divide and the notion that the upper classes are naturally morally superior to the lower classes. Will you decide what men shall live and what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than the millions like this poor man's child. O God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life amongst his hungry brothers in the dust. As the ghost dies and begins to fade, we see two ragged children appear from the folds of his robe, representing the many abused children of the factory port that had so compelled Dickens to write the story in the first place. Dickens names the children Ignorance and Want. Ignorance as a symbol of how the privileged classes dismiss the need for education amongst the working class and deem it unnecessary, and Want as a symbol of how the privileged intentionally perpetuate poverty for their own gain. Dickens warns that if these two children are continued to be treated in this horrible way, when they finally do grow up to become adults, they will inevitably spell out the collapse of society, trying to reclaim their agency through form of a revolution. Here, Dickens betrays his own fears about the future of England. There were many people at the time who suspected that a revolution like the one in France was just around the corner. And while some were in favor of it, many others, including Dickens, feared that it would bring violence and were staunchly against it. It should also be noted that even though he was a major advocate for reform and had an enormous amount of empathy for the working class, he himself was not immune to classism. When documenting his experience in the shoe polish factory, he wrote, "No words can express the secret agony of my soul as I sunk into this companionship of common men and boys." When he wrote about his experience visiting the Field Lane Ragged School earlier that year, huddled together on a bench about the room were a crowd of boys varying from mere infants to young men, with nothing natural to youth about them, nothing frank, ingenuous, or pleasant in their faces, low-browed, vicious, cunning, wicked, abandoned of all help but this, speeding downward to destruction and unutterably ignorant. And when giving a speech at the Liverpool Mechanics Institution, if mutual respect and forbearance among various classes be not found here, where else can that great lesson be imbibed? Differences of wealth, of rank, of intellect, we know there must be, and we respect them, but we would give to all the means of taking out one patent of nobility. It is pretty clear that while he believed everyone should be treated with respect and that the separation between classes had gotten out of hand, he did still believe that the class structure should exist. As he does in most of his other early works, Dickens places the blame for the condition of England on the individual. He postulates that if greedy, corrupt men such as Scrooge would change to be more like Fezziwig, society would be fixed. It wouldn't be until his later works that, as his perceptions about the world changed, he would gradually shift the focus of his criticisms onto institutions and societal structures. On December 2nd, 1843, Dickens had finished his 30,000-word manuscript and submitted it to his publishers under the title A Christmas Carol. His bank account was overdrawn, and he had written the entire thing in just 6 weeks. His publishers, who had lost faith in Dickens after a year's worth of Martin Chuzzlewit's poor sales, had little faith in the book, and so didn't bother to publicize it, and refused to pay the full publishing costs. Dickens, on the other hand, was immensely confident that the book would sell well, and thus paid out of his own pocket for extra details such as the red cloth binding, gilt-edged pages, and illustrations by John Leech printed in color. To add to the cost even more, he kept adding last-minute changes to the text even after it had been sent for printing. However, Dickens' persistence paid off. Kind of. On December 19th, the debut print of A Christmas Carol was released to the world, and within 5 days, all 6,000 copies had completely sold out. Dickens was beside himself with joy, estimating that his profits for the first month of sales would amount to around £1,000. Imagine his dismay when he opened up the envelope to find only £250 inside. As it turns out, all the expensive add-ons Dickens requested had created a significant decrease in the profit margin per book. To make matters worse, 2 weeks after A Christmas Carol's release, rival publisher Parley's Illuminated Library pirated the novella, releasing an abridged version at a much cheaper price. Dickens sued them and won, but Parley's, not wanting to have to pay him, declared themselves bankrupt. Dickens was left to pay his own legal fees himself, costing him £700, which would be around £93,000 today, or 124,000 US dollars. On February 5th, 1844, 3 separate plays based on A Christmas Carol were opened, and by the end of that month, that number had increased to 9. This was to be expected. Copyright law in Britain was still relatively new, and while authors were protected theoretically from other forms of literary plagiarism, that right did not extend to the stage. All Dickens' other popular works had been plagiarized and adapted in a stage rendition, often before all the installments were even out, so the playwright would have to make up an ending. The only way to combat this was to A, go through the painstaking process of writing a theatrical adaptation of the story himself, thereby acquiring the stage rights, or B, work together with a playwright to create an official version. This option would not grant them the stage rights, but it would ensure that there was at least one theatrical version out there that had artistic integrity, and that was better than nothing. So Dickens chose this route, sending proof sheets to his playwright of choice as soon as the book was out, so as to get his version out first and beat the competition to the punch. Dickens' selection for this particular rendition would be Edward Sterling, a popular playwright who was known for his numerous adaptations, some of them published just days after the original novel's release. Dickens' method did work to some degree. Sterling's play was able to predate most of the competition, being one of those 3 initial adaptations that had debuted on February 5th. His rendition was one that emphasized Scrooge's isolation and lack of emotional resonance, and was released under the title A Christmas Carol, or Past, Present, and Future, a burletta in 3 staves. Burletta is a term that can mean vastly different things depending on what year and what country you're looking at, but in 1840s England, it had come to be used as a generic term for spoken drama with varying amounts of music in it. Prior to 1843, there were very strict regulations governing the performance of spoken drama, which was considered to be a more serious and high-class art form, and could only be legally performed at theaters given permission by the king. To get around this, playwrights developed various genres of musical stage performance, such as pantomime, melodrama, and burletta. These plays would be performed in minor theaters for a working-class audience, and it was very rare that they were performed in isolation. Most of the time, a show would consist of a number of distinct enactments, each of them performed one after the other. Dickens had been a huge consumer of this type of entertainment when he was young, and had even written his own burletta in 1836, titled The Village Coquettes. Out of curiosity, he did attend one of these types of performances that was hosting a version of A Christmas Carol that he did not help write, and came away disappointed, reportedly calling it heartbreaking. Despite all the difficulties surrounding A Christmas Carol, both financial and emotional, Dickens continued to move on with his life. He and his family moved to Italy as they had planned, and would move around the continent a bit before returning to England in 1847. He left his publishers, Chapman and Hall, whom he had felt neglected and undervalued him, and signed with rival company Bradbury and Evans. In 1853, Dickens would perform his first public reading of A Christmas Carol, newly adapted for an auditory experience. He would continue on to perform a grand total of 127 times, continuing to make adaptations to the script up until his very last performance in March of 1870, 3 months before his death. So, why was A Christmas Carol so popular? Part of it has to do with the timing. As the age of industrialization was setting in, people were starting to become nostalgic for the Christmases of their youth, and in turn, a new form of Christmas culture was beginning to emerge. 1843, the very same year A Christmas Carol was published, was also the first year that Christmas cards were commercially sold, produced by a very busy man who didn't have enough time to write his relatives long Christmas letters, and so printed 1,000 cards instead and sold the extras. In 1846, the story A Little Match Girl was published. In 1848, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert would popularize the Christmas tree by having an engraving done of their family decorating it. And in 1853, the story of the Nutcracker and the Mouse King would be published. But more than that, Dickens' work arrived at a time when people were particularly ready to listen. Following on the heels of those two factory reports, Dickens wasn't wrong when he predicted that a story would have 20,000 times the impact of a pamphlet. And I think that part of the reason for that, aside from having characters that the audience can empathize with, is that it is easy to solve everyone's problems in a book. Scrooge becomes a good person, gives Bob Cratchit a raise so that Tiny Tim can live, and everything wraps up with a neat little bow. And even though reality is never that simple, for all its flaws, A Christmas Carol gave people hope that society could change, and called out each of its readers, imploring us to have empathy for all people in our lives, especially those with less privilege. Thank you for watching this video. It was a lot of effort. Dickens is not the only person who tried to rush something out before Christmas. This person here. So before I go, I just wanted to mention a few stories that I stumbled across while doing my research that were probably not influences on the story, but I still thought they were pretty interesting. One is a story that Ebenezer Scrooge was based on this gravestone that Charles Dickens found. The story goes that he was taking a walk by a cemetery and he saw this gravestone that said Ebenezer Scroggy, mean man, but he actually misread it. It actually said mealman, which meant that he sold grain. But in misreading this, he thought to himself, what a terrible fate this man has been assigned to. How mean of a person this man must have been, that his family decided to immortalize him under the title Mean Man. But it's not true. And then the other story that I came across was that Scrooge may have been based on the 18th century politician John Elwes. John Elwes was a notoriously frugal person and refused to spend money on anything. He literally found a pancake in his pocket one day that was months old and didn't want to spend money on lunch that day. So he's like, I'll just eat this pancake. It's still good. He was filthy rich, but refused to buy himself new clothes, let his house literally fall apart to the point of where he had to keep switching bedrooms because his previous bedrooms would deteriorate. But he was really only that way when it came in regards to himself. He was actually very generous when it came to lending other people money and never asked them to pay him back. And there's also the fact that his mother had the same frugal nature. So I think it's probably more to do with a hereditary disorder. It is possible that he influenced Scrooge, but since he wasn't actually mean and was actually generous when lending money to other people, I feel like it's not really that probable. And so that's the real end. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. So Charles was proceeding. I feel like it's weird that I called him by his first name.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I usually say Dickens.
Yeah, so Mr. Dickens, some as young as 3 years old.
That says 5.
5 years old. Too much numbers. I put so many numbers in this that probably are very boring. But I think numbers are interesting because they're concrete.